It's Alex. We're back talking again about color correction. In this case, we're going to be talking about basic color correction in Adobe Premiere. If you've watched my Final Cut Pro X color correction tutorial, you'll probably recognize what you're seeing here. It's two of the clips from the bike music video exercise. And so basically what we're going to do here is we're going to do the same type of thing as in the Final Cut tutorial. We're going to do a color correction of this video, but we're going to be using Premiere this time. Again, I mentioned this in the other video, but color correction is an art form in itself, and there are colorists who do it professionally. There are also companion programs or third-party programs that go with these primary editing programs, as in secondary programs outside of Premiere, Final Cut, or Avid that do color correction. However, as the years have gone on, the primary programs themselves, like Premiere, like Final Cut, have had better and better color correction effects and tools built into them. And so for that reason, a lot of times you'll see for even professional productions, they just edit the color within the program. They never go to some of those outside programs because the tools have become so effective. So you don't have to learn those other programs necessarily. It just depends on the scope of your project. I think if it's a feature film that's on a large scale, you might consider using those, of course, or a big commercial production. But for most independent filmmakers and amateur filmmakers, aspiring filmmakers, color correction within the program is totally fine. So I wanted to give you a couple tools to use to work on your own videos, and for the students in my film and video production classes, hopefully this will be some advice for how to touch up your movies before you, do your final export. Color correction should always be done at the very end of the process. This is after you've picture locked the movie. In this exercise, I'm doing it with two clips, just as an example, but normally it would be a completed project that I've already made my cuts, I've already done my basic assembly, and the movie's ready to go. Maybe the sound is still being polished, but besides that, it's virtually picture locked, except the color needs to be adjusted. And the reason we do color correction, again, is because despite the best efforts of our director of photography, there are usually some inconsistencies across shots, especially if you're shooting outdoors, like in this case with a video that's shot outdoors with these bike riders. The sun might go below a cloud in one shot, and then the cloud moves and you're out in the sun again. And of course, there's a inconsistency in the color temperature, how cool or warm it is, or how blue or red it is, the saturation level, how rich the colors are versus how washed out they are, and also the just the general levels, the exposure, the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows, the general exposure, lightness, and darkness. All that can be affected by the sun going under a cloud versus being, right out in the sun. But even if you shoot indoors, it happens quite a bit because, you're moving your setup, you're trying to adjust your lighting to make it match, but it doesn't always match exactly. Maybe there's some issues with the settings of the camera, and even despite your best efforts, you might see, even if your settings are matching as best they can, some inconsistency across shots, and that's just because of, there's limitations to how accurate we can be with, the exposure settings on the cameras and also the external lights we're using. So color correction is that little step later that helps smooth it all out and makes it feel more real, like it's happening in real time. Because nothing takes you out of the movie more than if you cut to another angle and it just looks darker or it looks a little bit bluer or whatever. You want it to match, just like you want the sound to match. You don't want that kind of inconsistency in sound where, you notice the cut. We just don't want to notice the cuts, and color correction helps with that. So again, I took the liberty of putting together virtually the same cut that I did in the Final Cut video. Okay, so you'll see it's these, we basically start on this very wide shot of the bike riders coming down the hill, and then we cut in a little closer. So if I play it here, we're coming down the hill, and then right there we cut on the bump to the closer shot. So there it is again. Okay, and you'll notice in this particular shot, The colors are a little bit brighter, probably a tiny bit more saturated, maybe a little warmer. I guess that's, well, maybe not a little warmer, but definitely more saturated. If you look at this one, they look a little bit darker, right? A little more washed down and darker. It doesn't quite look as lively. So the idea is we want to make these match. But even more so, or rather I should say before we do that, first and foremost, we need to make this clip look the way we want it, because you should always start with a particular clip to be your kind of template for the other clips. Make that one look as good as it possibly can, saturation-wise, color temperature-wise, exposure-wise, and then make the other clips match it. So this one, even as it is, it's better, but it's not where I want it to be. I want to push it a little bit further and kind of just help, make the colors pop a little more. And then once I get that, I'll go to this one here. So how do we do that? Okay, so first of all, if you turn to your panel over here, and hopefully, it depends what Premiere you're in, but I'm hoping you're either in CC or in maybe the last licensed version, which was CS6, and you'll see over here that you have a couple different panels. There should be one called Effects. You click on that, and if you don't see Effects, just go up here, Window, Effects will make it come up, okay? And so in Effects, I'm going to go ahead and turn to Video Effects. You'll see there's a couple different ones here. There's actually a video effects section called Color Correction right down here. So I'm going to choose Color Correction. I'm going to hit that little arrow to expand it. And there's a bunch of options. So this is where it starts to get intimidating, because you're like, oh, what am I supposed to do with this? How do I make heads or tails of this? Brightness and contrast, broadcast colors, change color. So there's a lot of different things you can do here. Some of them are going to be more effective than others, and some are, some are a little more basic. Some have other ideas to them. Change color is kind of like a different kind of idea where you're isolating a color. But if we're just trying to do general color correction, probably we're going to want to start with something a little more basic. Now there is something here called color balance. I just want to show you what that is. So if I go here, I click on it and I drag it over, holding the click down, and put it right. See how it's highlighting this clip? Let go of it. It's going to put that effect on there. So I'm starting with color balance, and you see next to it there's something that says HLS. I chose color balance HLS. Okay. Now I'm going to come up here to this panel, okay, our preview window, and there should be another panel that says Effect Controls. Again, if you don't see it, go to Window, Effect Controls. So I'm going to click on Effect Controls, and now, assuming this is the active clip, which double click just to make sure, I'll go back to Effect Controls, I should see up here the effects that I put on, right? So there's always going to be motion, opacity, and this kind of stuff that's just there if we want to mess with that. But we're not going to mess with that. Now I see color balance, HLS is here. So HLS stands for hue, lightness, and saturation. This is kind of like a one-size-fit-all kind of color correction. So if you just want to do some basic stuff, like just make it a little more saturated, hit the little arrow to expand it. I can go here and turn the saturation up. See, and it gets a little bit more green. I can go crazy where it's like super saturated color world. Or maybe the lightness. You want to bring the overall lightness up, go with that guy. Or the hue. You can change the hue to see how it's changing the general hue. The world is kind of changing to blue and green, and you can mess with it. So this, again, is more of a one-size-fits-all kind of color correction tool. So I actually don't want to use that one. So I'm going to select it and delete it. I just kind of wanted to show you what it was. There's another one here called Color Balance. It doesn't have the HLS. This is the more generic color balance one that has a couple more options, but it's not as super generic or basic as HLS. There's still going to be a more nuanced one than this one, but this one's kind of the mid kind of level intricacy one. So I'm going to click Color Balance, hold the click down, drag it in here onto my clip, and see how it adds color balance up here. And again, and it's already expanded. I could click this little arrow to collapse it, but it's expanded. You'll see all these different fields here. Shadows red, shadows green, shadows blue. Midtones red, midtones green, midtones blue. Highlight red, highlight green, highlight blue. So when you're looking at an image, the highlights will always be the lighter sections, like maybe that there's a sunspot or a brighter spot, like on this leaf here, this lighter spot. Midtones will be kind of like those middle kind of exposure level tones. And shadows will be the darker ones, like the dark vest there and that kind of thing. So you can adjust the color of those general areas and kind of influence them a little bit. So for instance, if I were to go to the highlights of red, the lighter red sections, I can make a little more red. So you can see areas that are a little bit lighter, like the ground and things like that, are starting to get a little redder. Now the vest doesn't seem as affected because it's darker. Okay, or maybe I want to go to highlight blue and make all those lighter areas a little blue. You can see it will affect it. And you can just kind of mess with this a little bit. Maybe I'll try shadow red now, and you should see some changes a little bit in. See, even now the vest is a little bit getting affected. It's still affecting the ground because there's some darker patches of dirt, but it's generally kind of affecting more of those shadows. So it's really the shadow, midtones, and highlights are more the kind of color affecting a certain exposure level, and if it's the bright, mid, or dark areas of an image. This one's not bad. It's still, I think, a little more basic compared to what you can do. So I'm actually going to choose this one and delete it. Okay. And I just want to show you one other basic one before we move on. And there is brightness and contrast, which you could drag onto the clip. And that will affect just the general brightness, kind of like the lightness one, basically again. And contrast, the contrast in the image. If you want it to be a little more contrasty, it's a little bit richer. Sometimes it's good to add a tiny bit of contrast to your images just to kind of bring it out. But again, it's a little more one size fits all. So what I want to do, okay, I'm going to get rid of that one. Let's come down here. Again, there's a lot of different ones here. But there's this one here called the three-way color corrector. Okay, three-way color corrector. I'm going to throw that one on there. And this one, some of you may have seen before. It's a little bit closer to kind of what you might have seen in Final Cut, where there's different parameters that you can adjust, and it's a little more nuanced in terms of what you can do. So you have color wheels here that you can mess with for the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. And rather than being represented by strips, you can actually now affect them by just moving this little sphere, or this little ball around, and it will affect the image. So if you wanted to kind of adjust the midtone, go on the pinker or redder side. If you wanted to adjust the shadows and go more in the green or purple, and it's a little bit more. It's not just the red, green, and blue, but you can actually go into orange and some of the other areas, and it will affect the image. And you can make it particular colors that might suit you. So that's a little bit more dynamic with what you can do there. And there's some stuff here with input and output levels that you can mess with in terms of how the colors are being affected. Again, it's represented here by the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. This one, the output level, just has sort of two, though, just the dark and the light end. Tonal range, again, this gets a little bit heady, so this is a little more, again, nuanced in terms of what it does. I don't mess around with that one too much. You'll see here there's saturation, master saturation, shadow saturation, midtone, and highlight. You can actually affect the saturation level of specific exposure levels. So you could make the highlights more saturated. See what I mean? Or you can make the shadows more saturated. So you can target specific areas with the saturation control. And there's a couple other ones down here. Secondary color, where it gets, again, some of this stuff gets a little beyond what we really want to do, but you can kind of mess with it a little bit, see if it gets kind of what you want. There's shadow hue, and there's midtones hue, and there's highlight hue too, if you wanted to mess with the hue. Balance gain, balance angle, that kind of thing. And then there's master levels. So you can actually affect the master output and the master input levels of black, gray, and white. But anyways, I'm going to just go ahead and do some basic color correction here. And the idea is you can kind of mess with this one a little bit. Has a little bit more control in terms of what you can do. It might seem a little overwhelming, though. That's why there is some of the more basic ones here if you want. And you could see kind of how you use the advanced one maybe in concert with some of the simpler ones to get the results you want. So what do I want to do here? If I remember from the Final Cut one, we kind of wanted to just bring out the saturation a little bit. And we also kind of wanted to make it a little brighter, and we wanted to warm it up a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the shadows here, maybe just move them a little bit. Just going to make it a tiny bit warmer. Midtones, highlights a little bit in the yellow direction. So I wanted to have that kind of almost like afternoon kind of look, you know, that it's being affected by. And there are eyedroppers here too, if you wanted to go ahead and sample a color and kind of find colors that way. Look at this, I'm going down here and sampling this redder area, and it's now choosing that kind of pink color, that red kind of pink color. So you can use the highlight tool too as well, but it's nice to just kind of use the wheel here. So I'm going to move that a little bit, okay. Maybe we'll mess with the master saturation, turn that up a little bit, right? That looks a little more master saturated. But maybe I want to be a little more specific now and say, you know what, I really want the bright areas to be very saturated. Because I want that tree there that's a little lighter to really pop. I want the shoulders, the kind of light vest to really pop. Don't really, you know, that's sort of the big thing. Then maybe I want to also adjust the exposure a little bit. You know, this might be a situation where maybe I want to throw, if I come back here, brightness and contrast on it after all. And I'm going to go to contrast and turn up the contrast a little bit. That's going to crunch the shadows a tiny bit like that. Okay. And that looks not too bad. Looks pretty good. I can mess around with it a little bit. So I took a few minutes and I made a couple more adjustments, and this is kind of what I ended up with. I wanted to have a very kind of, like with the Final Cut one, very saturated, looking more like it's kind of a little bit warmer. I even move this one up a little bit. Sort of, you know, midday kind of look, as opposed to it looking, you know, earlier in the day or late in the day. And notice here, input level, I did make some adjustments to the shadows, midtones, and highlights, and also the output level. If you're a user of Photoshop, you'll probably recognize this a little bit as being similar to levels, and also like in Final Cut, it's a good way to kind of crunch those shadows. And so I like to make the shadows, bring this slider a little bit to the right, the midtones a little bit to the left, so it kind of, you know, it crunches them a little bit. And then I brought up the highlights, so it makes it a little bit pop more. And then the general input or output level, you know, I can move this a tiny bit if I want to make it an aggregate change to it a little, make it a little bit darker if I drag to the left. Okay, so you can mess with these too, but if they seem a little intimidating, you can still go with brightness contrast. And some of this will, again, overpower in many ways what I'm doing here with this, because it is affecting it on a much more nuanced way with the shadows, midtones, and highlights. But you know, they will all affect each other in general. So this looks pretty good. I also wanted to mention there are other things like the Luma Corrector or the Luma Curve, which are, again, they're just other tools you could add to your arsenal. If I put the Luma Corrector on here, you'll see it has some of the same controls like brightness, like contrast, but it has a couple other things here like gamma, and there's some controls over the output, and just some tonal range definitions you can do. A little bit more, again, complicated. Same thing with the Luma Curve. If you've ever used curves in you know, Photoshop, you're probably thinking, oh God, curves. They're only really, I would use them only in situations where you have to get very specific types of lighting. Maybe you're sitting in, maybe it was a situation where you can see how dramatically it's affecting it. Maybe you were shooting and you were losing sunlight, and you have a shot on one side of a person, and then on the other side, it's darker and very, you know, grainy, and kind of your ISO is higher. You could do some kind of nuanced stuff with curves to kind of correct that. So curves would be, it's hard to really talk about the science of it because it's very particular, but curves are it's getting very messed up now, but curves are useful when you're trying to get a very specific type of lighting, and I would argue very specific type of lighting. But let's get rid of curves, because I think in most cases you're not going to have to turn to that. I really think that you'll find three-way color corrector maybe brightness contrast. Maybe in some cases you could just go to color balance instead of color corrector to suit your needs. Okay, so I'm happy with what this looks like now. Okay, so I'm going to come back to my source window. I'll look at the before and after side by side. It's like night and day. Very washed out, kind of looks a little darker. This is warmer. This is pops more. It looks like it's a more midday type of lighting. Much more appealing. And imagine taking your movie and just turning it into this. I mean, it makes such a qualitative difference, right? And if I go back now to my first clip, I want to apply that same look. Look how different they are. I want to make that first clip look like the second one. So what's something I can do? Well, they're not exactly the same types of clips to begin with, but it's helpful, I believe, to click on that second clip and go ahead. You're going to go to the effect controls and to copy what you've done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to collapse this effect, right? The three-way color corrector. I'm going to collapse the brightness contrast. I'm going to hold shift and, oops, actually make that command. I'm going to hold command and choose both of them and do edit copy. See how I'm selecting they're actually highlighted. I'm selecting both of them. And I'm going to go to my first clip, go to the effect controls, make sure it's active, and then hit paste. And look what it does. It pastes those two effects into this window. Now, it didn't have the desired effect I wanted because it's a different looking clip to begin with. It's making it much darker. And I think it's more the exposure that's the issue, not so much the color, because I do like the color that's come out, that's popped from these branches over here, these leaves. So I'm going to go to my brightness contrast, maybe bring the contrast down a little bit. Before I do any aggregate brightness control here, I'm going to go to the three-way color corrector. I'm just going to change this and make some adjustments here because it's clear that I need to rely a little bit. Oh, might bring this one over, bring this one back a little bit here. You can see it's already taking effect. I'm going to keep looking between the two. Okay, I think I also need to bring the saturation level up. So I'm going to come down here, master saturation, drag that over a little bit more. Probably all these need to go up a lot because it's a two very saturated image. Actually, I don't want too much on the shadow. Let's bring up the highlight a little bit. Oh, the highlight is all the way up. Okay, so we got quite a bit of saturation going. So maybe I'll do some color adjustment here just to give it a little more of that yellow. Drag it this way, a little more red. Oops, see what happens, you go way too much there. Drag it back, that's a little closer to where it was. I think maybe I'm going to go down a tiny bit to the green direction too, because it's sort of a yellow-green kind of look. And I also want to make it seem a little brighter. But still have those rich shadows. That's the challenge. Maybe I'll go down to my brightness control, move the whole thing up a tiny bit, just a tiny bit. And let's look at these two now. They're a lot closer, still maybe a tiny bit more. Yeah, looking at the grass, the saturation still needs to go up higher. So, and this is one of those situations where I might actually throw on another control here. I'm gonna throw on a color balance HLS. So I want to give it a little bit of extra saturation. I'm going to go to saturation down here. Move this one. Oop. I don't want to go too much, just a tiny bit to exaggerate it a little bit. And it's very close. I still just think it's, turn this down a little bit. There might be a little bit too much, red now. Okay, so I did a little more tweaking, and this is what I ended up with. You look at the before and after. It's like, again, night and day, how much this has been improved, this image. And if I go back to my effect controls, you can take a look. This is my final shadow, midtone, highlight color. This is my final exposure for the shadow, midtone, highlight, and the output levels. And I push these saturations pretty far, and as you saw, I even did a little bit with the brightness contrast. I ended up getting rid of this other saturation that I had added, a supplemental one, because I thought this was enough. But let's compare the two. Here's the second clip. Here's the first clip. Look at the grass. They seem to match pretty well. So I'm going to play them back one into the other. Look at the colors of the trees. And that's the idea. You try to make it as close as you can so it looks like it's one continuous shot. And you'll also notice over here I've added two more clips. One is a repeat of Multicam 4, the other is a repeat of Multicam 2. When I say repeat, I mean we cut back to those clips just a little bit further into the clips. And watch what happens when I get to them. Look, they're back to being that kind of muddy, desaturated, just not that great kind of look to the day. It looks really kind of just gloomy. So what I can do now is, since these are the exact same takes as these earlier clips, it's just a matter of pasting those attributes onto them. So I'd go to the other Multicam 4, and I'd collapse these effects. And by the way, this little FX screen, just so you know what that is, if I were to click here, I can turn those effects on and off. See, shows you the effect of turning them on. That's just if you want to flick it on, on and off basically. But anyways, I'm going to select the first one, hold Command, select the second. Again, edit copy, and I'm going to go to Multicam 4, the second instance of it, a little further down in the clip, and I'm going to come up to my effect controls, and I'm going to edit, paste, and you can see, look what it did to the clip. It's amazing. It's like magical, actually. Let's flip that off. That's what it looked like before. This is what it looks like with the color correction. Look how much it just pops. So much better. And same thing, I'm going to go to the first instance of Multicam 2. I'm going to choose the three-way color corrector, hold Command on my keyboard, click Brightness and Contrast, do an edit copy, or a Command C if I want, and come to Multicam 2, the second instance, and I'll do either an edit paste or Command V for paste, and it pasted it here too. Look at that. Just look at that tree there. Look at the difference there. If I turn the brightness off, whoops, didn't do that. And then turn the three-way color corrector off, makes such a difference. So let's play it the whole way through now. Looking good. All of those clips, so much improvement, and they all seem to flow together. You wouldn't even know that it was two different cameras shooting them. And that's color correction in Premiere, the basics of color correction. And I'm just telling you, it will make your films look so much brighter, so much more colorful, so much more alive. Just the quality of the film, or I should say the digital card. I mean, we don't really use film so much anymore. People will compliment it and say, oh my God, how'd you get that kind of color, that kind of exposure? And a lot of it, yes, it is on set. It is the work you do on set to get that kind of exposure, the work you do with your camera. But a lot of it comes down to this post-production work and, color correction. Even if there aren't problems with your image, it's great to just kind of make it pop a little more like this. This really turned into a very vivid looking afternoon of biking. So anyways, I hope this was helpful. I hope you use these tips if you are editing in Premiere, and we'll see you in the next tutorial.